Okay, good afternoon. Is this working? Yeah, I guess so. Okay, so we're gonna have this conversation going on between three very special people that are working in very different fields. We want to address the issue of looting and what's the meaning of this, let's say, of this notion. With the longer view, we're trying to refer of how looting is not only the removal of, let's say, of cultural heritage or of art from its original setting or being taken from its original owners, but it entails a whole set of practices and knowledge production or lack of knowledge production that affect the entire environment of culture. So here we have Fiona Greenland, Venetia Porter, and Cherri. Could you please introduce yourselves?
Thank you, Arie. Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm Fiona Rose-Greenland, and I am an archaeologist and a sociologist. I'm at the University of Chicago, where I teach in the Department of Art History, and I'm also leading a project which is trying to study the trade in looted artifacts out of the region controlled by the Islamic State. Thank you.
So I'm Venetia Porter. I'm very glad to be here. And I'm a curator at the British Museum. I've been there for a very long time. I work on our Islamic collections, but also on building our collection of modern and contemporary Middle Eastern art. My big project at the moment is that we're completely redisplaying our material to do with the material cultures of the Islamic world. And this is a very exciting new project that I'm deep into right now.
Great. Ali?
Hello. So I'm Cherri. I'm from Beirut. I've been working a lot in the past couple of years with archaeology and notion of writing historical narrative by looking at the artifact or the place of the archaeological object and writing historical narrative.
Great. So what we're going to begin with is somehow in the last year, inside of the terrible events in Syria, Palmyra has become a part of the daily news. What's even more interesting is that it has received a lot of attention from the art world. And there is the Art Forum is writing about it, and the Hyperallergic is writing about it, and all these magazines. And it's fascinating, like why the art world has this specific fixation on this topic today, addressing cultural destruction. So I want to start introducing this concept of looting, and I want you, Ali, to speak a little bit about, about this and your research, how you relate to this field in order to expand the discussion a little bit.
When you mention the word of looting, like for me, I look at this as a moment of violence, but not like as an accidental violence that's happening today on archaeological, like in archaeological history, but really in violence that's embedded in the archaeological project itself, whether from the start of archaeological project, which was in colonial time and with the colonial history, but also with the more recent histories of, like I'm interested, of course, in the Arab region with the rise of the Arab nationalism, of moments of destruction, of theft of archaeological sites, but also even in the gesture of digging up the earth as a transgressive gesture. I mean, the moment when we are digging up the earth, I see there's something uncanny brought up with this gesture, and all these moments of violence are quite embedded within this, how at least modernity deals with ruins and heritage. So the way I try to read this is not just as a contemporary moment, but try to make it more complex, political, historical, all these issues that come within it.
And Fiona, can you let's give us your view on how you see this notion of looting and the role it plays in the bigger cultural picture of today?
Well, and as somebody with archaeological training and somebody who has done hands-on dirt excavation, I can offer, from my point of view, a very practical definition of looting, which is the removal of artifacts from the soil without authorization, and often in a way that's not in accordance with scientific principles of excavation. And as we all know, there are a set of consequences that come from that, including a loss of important historical and scientific knowledge, which tells us so much about the object and how it would have been used. And I think that Palmyra is a really important case to start with, because as Ali says, looting is not new in the region or really in any part of the world, but what Palmyra does is crystallize, really symbolize in that one place the entire program of cultural cleansing that ISIS has unleashed. And that's the combination of the purposeful destruction of monuments, looting of objects, the destruction of museum collections, and then the dispersal of the contents, and, of course, atrocious crimes against human beings. And we can think here of the brutal arrest, torture, and execution of the director of the Palmyra Antiquities Museum that happened last August. So Palmyra, I think, nicely contextualizes looting and allows us to look at the different dimensions of the cultural destruction there.
Now, Venetia, as we have here two different concepts of looting, I would like to hear from you how, what's the institutional view? How does the institution view the process of looting? And not necessarily how do they respond to it, but how they view it.
Well, I think that we as an institution would agree completely with Fiona that her definition of what looting actually is, which is and it has been going on for thousands of years. You only have to think of the tombs of the pharaohs in Egypt and how they were robbed long time ago. So looting has been taking place for a very, very long time. So if we define looting as taking objects out of the ground illegally and then taking them out and selling them, yes, so for the purposes of making money, whether it's Daesh doing it or indeed anywhere else, this is absolutely the position in the museum that we deplore such. Absolutely.
And like there is, as we discussed previously, there was this story in the news about the British Museum safekeeping some artifact from Syria. What do we know about this?
Well, that's a very complicated story, and actually I have to say that there are a lot of crossed wires about this, because I was actually trying to, knowing that you were interested in this issue, I was trying to find out actually a little bit about it, and it actually turned out that it was an object that had come out illegally. And I don't know exactly what the circumstances were. And this is actually part of what the British Museum does and has done for a very long time, is that we are often alerted by either the Art Loss Register or indeed other people that an object has appears on the art market, and what can we find? What can we tell people about it? So we would look to see whether it's something that's been published in a museum catalogue or something like that. In terms of this particular object, I gather it had an inscription. It's said to come from a particular site. So my understanding is that what happened with this object is that we were asked by the police because we work a lot with the border police, by the police to actually study this object to try and find out its context and all of that. And I understand that it's a subject of an ongoing investigation and is back with the police. So I'm not sure that particular object symbolises that the British Museum is looking after objects that have been stolen from Syria, because that is not the case.
Okay, and since the British Museum, it's an institution from the colonial period, how do you establish the distinction between, what is considered looted by the British Museum?
Goodness, that is a very complicated question. Arie, a very, very interesting one. I think that we would not consider that these objects that came out of Iraq in the 19th century, which were done in terms of they were excavations, organized excavations, and so on. People were taking these objects out of the ground for the purposes of knowledge, and these would not be put in the same category as something that is being taken out of Syria now, or indeed all the material that came out of Iraq during triggering sanctions. So I think one has to be very, very careful. And this is a very complex area, and to lump everything that is in any museum as objects that have been looted, I think is quite a dangerous premise.
I'd like to add 2 points to that comment, and I think it's an important comment. So this question of providing safe haven for museums is one that a lot of museums are asking. And in September 2015, the Association of Art Museum Directors issued an important statement, the Protocols for Safe Haven for Works of Cultural Significance from Countries in Crisis. And the basic idea here is that when museums come across objects that probably come from a zone that's currently engaged in war or other form of political instability, if, in other words, there is a risk that that object will be destroyed if it's returned to its country of origin, then the museum can take the action to access it and provide conservation treatment and then keep it for a period of time. Now, there are lots of questions about how this will work in reality, but the important point is museums are thinking about this and want to play a role in protecting objects that are at risk. Now, along with this, I think it's important to point out that museums are merely one kind of institutional actor in a greater legal space of trying to protect antiquities. And there's a 3-pronged approach internationally. Basically, you have national laws that protect antiquities, claim them as state property. These are things that are already in the ground, and these laws exist all over the world. There are bilateral agreements, country to country. We're here in Switzerland. Switzerland has bilateral agreements with Italy, for example, and Greece. Both countries agree to monitor the flow of antiquities into each other's countries, and I should say cultural property more broadly. And then we have international conventions like the Hague Convention in 1954 or the UNESCO Convention of 1970. These are very important conventions too, which signal a broader willingness on the part of international states parties to protect sensitive cultural material of historic significance. So when we talk about what the BM is doing or what a museum does, we have to remember that it's not acting in a vacuum. There is this broader context of discussions and laws that have to be taken into account for any particular object or department.
I just want to add just to the matter of the safe haven, because certainly at the British Museum we were very involved in objects that were coming out of Afghanistan in exactly the circumstances that you're describing. And we did look after pieces there. And also there was this museum in exile in wherever it was, the Bucharadici Museum. And so museums do have this role. And actually the British Museum was very involved in helping the return of a lot of objects to Afghanistan when the conflicts ended. So yes, I mean there are a lot of different things, as Fiona says. They're all of us working in these cultural institutions are all working together. And the UNESCO Convention is a very important one because what that did, it was in 1970, but it was actually implemented in 1972, was that it drew a line. It was actually saying yes, a lot of things were happening before until that time, but in a sense we have to start again. And so at the British Museum, we do not acquire an object unless we know where it's been since 1970. And that is absolutely across the board. So that's very, very important, these protocols and conventions that were set up.
And what happened with the case of Greece, that Greece laid this claim against the British Museum? What happened with this?
You know, Arie, that if we start talking about the Parthenon Marbles or the Elgin Marbles, we will be here all for the rest of the evening. I'm not a spokesman on that subject. I think it's a very, very complicated issue, and actually, the person who knows much more about this and has written very interestingly about it actually is Fiona. But it's certainly true to say that that Elgin acquired this material as he thought legally, and there was a lot of debate, and eventually these objects came into the collection, but they have become something else, actually, kind of nationalist objects, both for Greece and, as you've argued, actually, Fiona, very interestingly, for in British context as well. So Fiona is a much better person to talk about these than me.
Why, thank you, Venetia. You know, Arie, I also think that the Elgin Marbles is an important, we could call them the Parthenon Marbles, in fact, to kind of shift the political frame there. Obviously a very important case, and one that raises a series of critical questions about the role of museums and then how objects are removed from a context and then acquire different narratives, are shaped by different peoples who see something in them. These are artworks, after all, who reflect something back. But what we can say, and what I think would be a productive conversation, would be the question of restitution. This is especially important for thinking ahead to when peace comes to the region, and the region we happen to be discussing is Syria and Iraq right now, but there are other regions of the world for which this is the case. Rampant looting happening in Southeast Asia, for example. Countries that find that their cultural heritage has been dispersed to private collections or museums and want the objects back. That, I think, is a really important question, and a whole class of problems and opportunities attach themselves to that question.
I just want to comment on this, because I feel like with this kind of discussion that's happening today, with this moment, if you consider this as a moment of crisis for historical heritage and for archaeology in general, and what I feel is like we're just like moving forward and already redoing what we've been doing for the past century. And while I look at this moment as a time to reflect of this whole archaeological project of preservation, what have we been doing for the past 100 years? I mean, when you speak about the role of the museums, I mean, you can speak about like major museums, but also you have to look more on the ground, on local museums, or like who's doing the looting. Like there's Daesh, of course, but like in most Syrian villages, it's the people from Syria themselves who are doing the looting. But this is also because of certain feeling of disconnection between that this is not our history, or this history, like particularly with totalitarian Arab regimes, was used as an oppressive tool for, you know, like a narrative, you know, of let's say with Gaddafi, where he says like he's a direct descendant of the Akkadians and the Akkadian kings, and even he had his face carved in one of the archaeological sites. Like all these regimes used history and historical narrative and I mean the symbolism of the ruin in order to install their power. So what's happening today is, of course, a result of a certain very specific political context. And if looting is happening, it's much more complex than just pointing out, yes, Daesh is today started destroying. I think it's important to look at this in a much more complex way, and the role of these institutions, of course, is important, but also like sort of like a reassessment, or at least reconsidering like what value have we put in these objects? Because if you consider that the moment we have put a certain market value, or certain, like let's say museum value, because these objects, once they enter the museum, they gain a certain certain like monetary value. So can we think of these objects outside of this value system that we've created around them? And this is not something coming out of, out of the blue. Like, this is happening in other societies, in other places where history has been preserved for thousands of years just because no one was trying to preserve it. No one came and said, we should preserve this site, we should put a fence and ask people to buy a ticket and come in and look at this history as an object, as a commodity. And I think that's where the problem really is.
It's also, I mean, it's really interesting you should say that, Ali, because I think that so many of us were really, really struck following the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003, when people actually looted their own museum. And I think there was such a sort of lack of understanding is how could people loot their own objects? And it's just completely, I mean, I'd be really interested to hear from you, because it's as though there's a complete disconnect between people and their past. That they saw that. So what were they seeing in these objects? They were seeing them as somehow connected to the Saddam regime or what. So there was no connection between them and these objects that were their history.
But these objects become part of a certain local conflict, and they become part of, like certain narrative. Like I know this, for example, in Lebanon, with with the recent war history, and how there's it's very deep disagreement on on historical narrative in Lebanon. So these objects become symbols that have been recuperated by certain parties or certain ideologies. So when you're fighting them, you're fighting the ideology that's behind them. And this idea of thinking that there's something universal in preserving, or there's something universal in appreciating ruins, it's not. It's a construct, and it was a construct of Western modernity. And we all know the history of archaeology. So we cannot not recognize where this whole gaze, if you want to call it, the phantasma that's behind these ruins, or the ideologies that are behind the construct of these ruins, without understanding what's happening today.
Absolutely.
What's fascinating for me about that is that in the Western media, the received wisdom about the purposeful, performative destruction of cultural heritage sites in the region has been, this is an attack on Western values and on the notion of a universalizing history. And yet, I think what you bring into this conversation that's critical is that may be the case, but that's only one small slice of the narrative. That is to say, there's also a region-wide understanding of the symbolism of these monuments, of these sites, as being deeply embedded in contemporary politics. So, for example, Bashar al-Assad loved the site of Palmyra, staged Ba'ath Party events there. And what's the first thing that ISIS does upon taking over the city? One of the earliest acts of violence, notoriously, is the mass execution of Syrian soldiers in the very amphitheater that Bashar al-Assad likes to associate himself with. Similarly, Saddam Hussein operated a kind of historical symbolism whereby he saw himself as continuing a long line of Assyrian kings, fitted himself nicely into that narrative. So again, then when we see the destruction of ancient heritage sites in Iraq, we must also be thinking, this is the latest statement in a long series of political claims. And I think that that's a narrative that many people, like myself, from outside the region, have a harder time getting our heads around.
And that's totally true. I mean, this idea of this coming back of the symbolic value of these objects in a very, very violent way. I mean, that's what when Daesh, when ISIS is at least that's the official discourse that ISIS says, when they're destroying a statue, it's because it represents a certain god, or people used to worship this statue, or this used to a temple, where we don't see it anymore as a god or as a temple, and you can even trace back in history when there was this even an illegal document where we've dissociated the symbolic value of these sites or of these objects from a historical or a architectural or a artistic value as well. I mean, I know in France, after the French Revolution, when churches were destroyed, and there was the first legal a document that mentions historical heritage and the preservation of historical heritage, not because of their symbolic value where they symbolize, the power of God on earth or whatever, but because of the historical importance of these churches and of these religious monuments. So there was a clear distinction that we should preserve not for the symbol, but for other values. And now all of a sudden we look at, and we don't understand why are these sites are being destroyed. So,
because they also belong in this world in which they were kind of operational symbols in the fabrication of history, and in the fabrication of the direction of history, and also with at the same time with the birth of the museum as a colonial institution back in the day. Let's say the exhibition of these archaeological artifacts was also a closure of the past. You know what I mean? Saying, been there, done that, and let's not talk about this anymore. We got it, we got it figured out. Of course, along the way, now we have this more profound understanding of how this violence, as you say, this violence that modernity performed, not only through archaeology, but actually through ethnography, and other disciplines, the birth of the social sciences, how it was so well connected, I mean, intellectually and politically to the realities of the colonial project. And from there on, if we look at the place that these artifacts, their antiquities, are not occupied today, I mean, there is also a reality very well known to us here in Basel about outside of this framework of politics of culture in which museums interact with institutions and organizations and state. I mean, there is a market for this as well, which it's not surprising to say that it's perhaps one of the few places in the world which is more opaque than the art world. And it's really difficult, but because it's completely unregulated, and you stand in this situation in which, basically you don't know what you're doing wrong.
Sorry, what do you mean?
Yeah, in the trade of antiquities, there are even less rules than the rules that exist in the art market, because somehow here you need, there are issues of provenance, especially in secondary market here, which have relatively high standards of accountability. These standards, I don't think that are so clear in the antiquities market, and I think maybe you know a bit more about this world of antique dealers.
Well, so yes and no. I think the point about a general lack of regulation is interesting, but we have to appreciate that there are professional standards. We can say there are some self-imposed regulations as well, best business practices. Mainly I know the scene in the US because that's where I've done research and have spoken with antiquities dealers. The dealers that I know and have spoken to are uniformly concerned about things like provenance because they want to be able to sell objects. And many buyers, collectors, are very savvy and understand that if they purchase an object without legal title, they are vulnerable. They could have to give that back to the country of origin, and they've committed theft. So I think it's a little bit misleading to say this is completely unregulated. I mean, there are regulations, and then because of the legal framework, as I described earlier, everybody's aware of the potential consequences. Now, having said that, the kind of 800-pound gorilla in the room is the fact that the looting that we have seen in the region must be connected to market interest. I can't imagine that people are digging things from these remote sites for a hobby, right? I mean, there's some kind of monetary incentive to digging this. And so this is where I think the picture is emerging, but it's really important that we concentrate our efforts on understanding where things are going, who's buying, and what are the consequences of this system as it currently exists.
Because I think that in the case of Syria and Iraq, and let's say the looting and destruction being done by ISIS, and they say, okay, they have this X amount of revenue that is coming from these archaeological artifacts, but this would be an impossible scenario without the cooperation of dealers. I mean, in the West, because I don't think
it's dealers everywhere. I mean, I was saying before that one of the things that was amazed me was when I was in Syria a long time ago now, that I was at a site called Balis Meskene. And so there was a lake there, and I saw this extraordinary sight of a few hundred meters apart. There were maybe 6 or 7 women sitting there digging with shovels. And I went up, being a curious person as I am, I went up and started chatting to one of them. I said, "What are you doing?" And she told me that basically she would get, X number of Syrian pounds for a gold coin, that she'd get, probably a piastre for a pottery shirt and all that. And that basically that's what she was doing in order to feed her family. And they were middlemen there. And who would then, if something amazing had been found in the ground in this site, then that would have been passed on. So there is a whole incredible network that has been going on for centuries, actually, probably, but that has been exacerbated by these political situations. So, why do you think so much stuff came out of Iraq during sanctions? It was because people needed to eat. They just couldn't get things, and so they would hear that, actually, if you went and dug there, that you would get something. But the trouble is that you could put a really sort of dark view of this, which is actually that without the art market, without the antiquities market, you would not have looting, because there would be nobody to buy these things. So that's kind of the situation. You take these objects out of the ground in all these different circumstances, you rob them of their history completely. And that's what's happening. And it's going to go on happening unless somehow or other these markets are regulated. But they're very unlikely to be completely. There are a lot of people who are saying, museums are saying, no, we won't, like us, we won't buy something unless we know where it's been since 1970 or 1972. But there are a lot of people who are buying these things, and they're going into private collections and so on. So that's what's happening.
I mean, I recall being in a house in Lebanon, where they had in the shelves of the living room 40 Akkadian statuettes, these terracotta statuettes. And 40, it's more than the archaeological museum in Beirut has. And I'm sure it's not the only place where these things exist.
Definitely. I mean, what we're also discussing, I don't know if you know now, they're building the History Museum of Beirut, which is most of the collection that they're doing. It's a project that Solidaire, which is a private company that built the downtown area in Beirut, and with the Ministry of Culture. And most of the objects that are going to be in the History Museum of Beirut are coming from private collections. And most of these were looted from Syria, and from not from a recent war, like a long time ago. And these are now just sitting in people's houses. And then the project started because people said, we're willing to give these away and to give them to a certain museum if there's a certain structure that's willing to accept this. But also this raises a question. I mean, it's the question of the validity of a national museum, especially in a place like Beirut today. I mean, we know with the violent recent history, and what does it mean today to have another or a new museum of Beirut, like history of Beirut? What does it mean? Who's building it? What kind of narrative is gonna be who's gonna be writing this history of this museum? And what are these objects gonna say? I mean, we're interested. I mean, in this history of these objects are where they're coming from, which century, how did they get here, what are they for? But there's also the more recent history of these objects. Like these objects are coming, from a violent, an incident or through theft from Syria. And this becomes also an integral part of the history of these objects. I mean, it's not only 5,000 years of history and it stops and there's a big blank and today they end up in a museum. I mean, this whole history of how these objects end up in a museum is as important and as interesting as the actual object itself.
I think the other thing is that, it has to be said that museums are presenting the narratives of these objects in much more interesting and provocative ways, actually, than they ever did before. So, in all of our institutions, there are really fascinating things, being done. I mean, just a, tiny thing that I worked on a while ago is that we acquired some work by Michael Rakovitz, whose work I'm sure you know. And so he was very inspired by, very angry about the objects that were looted from Iraq, and he recreated them in papier-mâché. And so I did a very tiny little display where I put those objects next to objects of the type that had been looted. And it was so fascinating because it generated so much discussion and debate. It was only one showcase in a gallery. And I think museums are really doing very interesting things like that. And you had a very interesting example about something going on in Detroit. That's that you were talking about.
Exactly. So the Detroit Institute of Art has redone its Near Eastern galleries. And they have a couple of cases of Jordanian antiquities. And some of these objects have a questionable provenance history. So questions about how they came out of the ground, but also whether they're genuine. And so rather than cover this up or choose not to display these, the DIA displays them with didactic materials that address these questions. And so the viewer is led through a series of questions questions and a kind of, on the one hand, on the other hand, kind of debate about these objects and their authenticity. So this is just one example of many, as you say, of how museums are playing a role in producing a critical discourse about antiquities and where they come from.
So, I mean, there's something about Lebanon that completely fascinates me, and I'd love to hear. Actually, we're seeing some of Ali's work. You're going to talk about that soon. That's great. But you know, when you think of Lebanon, you know, a country of 4 million people, 1.5 million refugees, you know, all the terrible things going on, rubbish. You know, everybody knows all the things that, you know, poor Lebanon is like hanging by a thread sometimes. And yet, every time I go there, I am blown away by what's going on culturally. I mean, the number of new galleries. I mean, there are so many new museums. The Sursok Museum now has opened its doors, doing fantastic exhibitions. There's this Museum of History you're talking about. There's a possibility of a Museum of Lebanese art now. There are so many different cultural activities often associated with museums. So there's something very interesting going on about museums actually now.
Well, definitely. I mean, I don't pretend I cannot even understand what's happening, but I mean, of course it's filling a certain gap, maybe a certain missing discussion that's not happening on a political level. And I think it's also what happened maybe right after the end of the Civil War, when you had a generation of artists, you know, like Walid Ra'ad and Akram Zaatari and Rabi Amrou and all these artists who were questioning the notion of the document and the historical narrative and all this, because coming out of a certain type of crisis. I just want to comment on the images that we're seeing here. These are installations called Fragments, and two different. One of them is the installation is in Sursa Museum actually now, part of an exhibition called Taxonomy of Fallacies: The Life of Dead Objects. And these are just because we were talking about the market. So these are objects that are bought on the legal market from auction houses. So they all come with a certificate of provenance, though like. Most of these are probably fake because I'm not paying big loads of money to buy them. So, and this becomes part. I mean, it's one of these gestures that's important for me. That to these objects that had their certain type of shorter history, that to bring them again in a museum context, to bring them again, they enter the museum, but in a new form of taxonomy, like presenting not, like a historical narrative where, like a certain chronology where say, first there was this, and then this, and that's the object or the index to prove, and that's the proof of what we're saying. But let these objects come from different sources, even forged or real, authentic, wherever they're coming from, and when they'll be like on this sort of looking at the museum as a place of all these objects, of coming together of the objects, coming together on a platform that's actually what it does with this light table. It erases their shadows. They become objects without.
You don't put museum labels next to them.
No. And the idea is like. We are used to how to ask objects to speak to us, or try to treat objects as like a hidden text where we have to decipher what these objects have to say, or they have to speak to us, and try to propose a certain taxonomy that's not addressed to us, where these objects are not, though when you enter the room, all these objects are actually looking at you, but there's like a sort of, they're looking at you, but you are not the subject. They're not speaking to us, and they're in a form of, if we could imagine or at least accept a certain presence for these objects to tell a story that's not anyway speaking to us or like addressed to us.
Because I think there in the context of the object and especially the ruin, there is this idea of the symbol, meaning is suspended. So if you want to take these archaeological artifacts and reinsert them again in their original setting and context, it doesn't work. You know what I mean? It's an object which is already cut from a symbolic system which either no longer exists or has been transformed.
The violence that has been done on these objects. If these objects were extracted, you cannot, to pretend that we can give them a voice again. I think it's part of the same construct of thinking that these objects can speak to us, or we are able to make them speak again, or a different story.
They do speak to us because, and unless those objects had come out of the ground at different moments in time, we would be ignorant of all of these extraordinary civilizations of the past. So they are speaking to us all the time.
We construct our narrative on them, but
yeah.
they are not. I mean, that's the. I'm not saying you cannot read these objects.
No.
You can, but they are not hidden text to be. There's not a truth behind these objects to be discovered.
Yeah.
These are objects that we construct. I mean, they are objects that are created with our discourse, and they're only present through our discourse.
Absolutely, and what's so lovely about your work is that you're actually creating a completely new discourse, actually, about them, this suspended time, suspended objects. It's a very, very interesting way of looking at the past of these antiquities.
Venetia, could you?
Yes.
I mean, now that we got to the contemporary art, actually.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about the most recent exhibition that you made at the BM?
The most recent exhibition that I did was an exhibition on the pilgrimage to Mecca on the Hajj, and that was in 2012. And what I was interested in there was really to think about the subject of Hajj and how could you represent these journeys across time and so on. And so what I did was that I used a lot of different kind of material to tell that story. So for me, a piece of contemporary artwork by Kader Attia or Ahmed Mater was as important as a famous manuscript from the Bibliothèque Nationale or even a bus ticket. And so what I was doing was using objects in order to tell and construct a particular story. And what was very interesting about that exhibition was that it drew an audience who we had not seen at the British Museum before, really. People were coming from all over the country. There were a lot of people from different Muslim communities who really bought into this. That's the wrong word. I mean, they owned it. It was a very, very interesting thing. I'd go in every day into the exhibition, and I'd see Muslims talking to non-Muslims, explaining to each other, comparing pilgrimages and that sort of thing. So it was a very interesting and very extraordinary experience for me to do that exhibition, and really trying to see the place of contemporary art within that. So in a sense, nothing had a greater priority than anything else.
Because I think that contemporary art, in a way, I mean, at least at the stage where we are now, there is this certain obsession with history, which you can see across the spectrum in the practice of many artists. Somehow, because we feel that we're losing this historical horizon with, let's say, with the hyperspaces we're living in. We talked about the gaze from nowhere, that we're receiving our information about the world from satellite art, which are not necessarily images made for humans or by humans. And in that context, let's say that art and cultural heritage plays a role now, which is not only to solidify the historical narrative, but sometimes to melt it. You know what I mean? To also to disestablish this linear history, in this like the teleology of history, as we received it from the colonial period. And now I'm thinking of an interesting case, which is, I mean, coming back from the ancient world and the Islamic world to Europe and basically to Switzerland, where there is the proposal by the director of Documenta to show the Gurlitt collection or a part of this Gurlitt collection during Documenta. And this was something, I mean, work which was looked recently, back to Second War, was now the legal issues are still clearing up. There is a negotiation going on between these institutions. And I would like to hear from you, like, what do you think if this is it a good idea to exhibit this collection as a part of a major art institution, or what will be the best way to deal with this?
So I don't know, because the Gurlitt collection still has many unanswered questions connected with it. Perhaps most crucially, who are the legitimate claimants for many of these pieces? So that comment that you gave us started with the phrase obsessed with history, thinking about contemporary Middle Eastern artists, and then you took us through to a very current discussion about Nazi-era looted art. And I think that what connects these spaces is art doing important work. Art working across national boundaries and political boundaries to try to come to terms with historical change, in fact, historical upheaval. One of the things I find very interesting as a researcher is that if we look at cases of restitution or disputed claims over artworks that were dispersed during the Second World War in Europe, we can think about artworks themselves standing in for victims. That is to say, we've reached a point in discussions about Holocaust, restitution, reparations, and healing at which there are so few direct victims or victims of Nazi persecution. And so artworks themselves have a story to tell about the violence from that period, about cultural cleansing and the attempt to snuff out entire lines of history and entire peoples. So I can't answer the question about whether Documenta should or shouldn't show the Gerlich collection, but the reason it would even be proposed, I think, or controversially received, is that art is important in having these kinds of conversations and in doing this work of critically deconstructing history.
Because I think that now, for example, when we discuss the restitution of cultural property, so you're saying, okay, should this be returned to Iraq? Should this be returned to Syria? But now, we have a case which was reported recently that is also closer home, when the statues that were taken from Berlin by the Soviets were found in the Pushkin Museum. So the Germans want them back, and the Russians are not giving in. So they have these joint teams which are working on the restoration, documentation, and perhaps providing some new context for this question of restitution is not necessarily always returning. You know what I mean? There could be different contexts also, because these statues, as you say, the role that art plays, are telling the history of this war, and what happened between Germany and Russia. And it's really amazing that in a major institution like the Pushkin Museum, nobody knew this stuff was there for 70 years.
There was a very interesting debate at the British Museum soon after the Iraq War, actually, it was centered around the question of all these big monuments that were in Baghdad. Should they be kept or not? And there were two protagonists, and one was arguing that actually no, we want to get rid of everything of the Saddam era. This is too painful, and all of this.
Okay. Yeah.
But the other protagonist, it was really interesting, was somebody who was very much of a historical cast of mind and was saying, no, these things should be kept because they are the product of an era. And it's so, I'm sure there are lots. Also you made that incredible film about the statues coming down in Syria of Assad. And actually, I don't know whether the same debate was going on about that as well, actually.
Just want to comment quickly on this idea of restitution. I think it's now becoming also a very interesting question and questioning lots of things that are at the essence of archaeology. There was this case now with the French museum where they had Maori heads, and it was between New Zealand and the French, and they wanted to get back the heads, and there was a very big legal dispute. And then there was a law now that says that if you can name the human remains, you have the right to get them back, which I think it opens a very interesting question. So after this, New Zealand was capable of returning the head of the Maori tribe because they could name who was this person, but there was 4 other heads which were anonymous. These they could not take them back. And again, just to close, what we were discussing about this idea of the symbolic value of things, I think in a situation like here, you could see the ethical, symbolic question comes back in a very urgent way about naming the dead and who owns the dead. So yeah.
I think
the past, who owns the history? What is this history? Whose history? Absolutely.
I think as a kind of a conclusion, I'd like to say that this longer view that we've had now about looting, well, it makes me a little bit hopeful in the sense of there is a lot of violence and destruction going on. It seems as if we have a certain intellectual understanding of, let's say, of the grand scale of the things that happened during the colonial period, which we're trying to fix. Also, I think that there are many institutions, by no means all, but there are many institutions, very, very important ones, and also smaller ones, that are trying to take significant steps in placing art and culture and history in a kind of a more seamless space in which, let's say, history is not like the structure is deconstructed so that it can become more accessible. So it seems like as if we are walking into this period that in spite of all the violence and destruction, we may have a more, let's say, a personal and individual relationship to heritage, which is not dominated by, let's say, by this kind of imperial form of history. And then it's no wonder that archaeology and history is so important for contemporary art today. So now we have time to take a few questions. You guys are interested.
Hi, I wanted to know, I mean, I know there's the art loss register, but is there something tangible people can do if you spot something that you think might be a looted piece? Is there a specific entity that we could contact, or do we just go to the nearest museum? What's in place to help actually really stop it that we can do?
Well, there are certain practical things. The Art Loss Register is a very good institution, and it's a place of reassurance. So if somebody wants to buy something, they can take it to the Art Loss Register, and they will check to see if somebody has looted it or has taken it from somewhere or not. One of the difficult things sometimes is that countries don't report things that were looted. And so it happened, actually, something I worked on at the British Museum some years ago, where there was a tombstone, and it was actually the Art Loss Register said to me, "There's something strange about this. Are you aware of this having been stolen?" Well, in fact, it was published in a book. It was the first book that I went to on the bookshelf about this particular group of objects, and it turned out that it had come out of a mosque in Iran. But unfortunately, it hadn't been reported, so it was quite a complicated thing. I mean, it did eventually go back, but I think it's difficult. You can go to museums if you're concerned about something, and the museum might be able to check whether that object has been published, for example. So then immediately, like in the case that I've just cited. So then that's easy. But the difficult thing is when you've got all these objects that have been dug out of the ground, so have lost their provenance. So that is quite a difficult thing. But I'm sure you've got something to add here, Fiona, about this.
Well, no, you've put your finger on what's actually a really big problem, that there is no, apart from the Art Loss Register, there's no kind of single authority that could actually be monitoring in any systematic fashion. So it depends a little bit about on where you spot the object that's questionable. Is it on eBay, or do you see it in kind of a bricks and mortar shop? In which case, really, it's about the local authorities. So in the United States, for example, if we see something dodgy in a dealer's shop, the received wisdom is to contact the FBI. Now, how many of you have the FBI, like, Twitter feed or phone number, right, on your cell? Nobody. So it takes a few steps, actually, to report it. And I will just finally say there have been some interesting attempts at crowdsourcing, so to try to get some kind of project web-based where people can report questionable objects. That has come in kind of fits and starts. So it shows that there's definitely a conversation about this and an awareness of needing a longer-term solution.
It's very interesting that in Sharjah, actually, Sharjah museums, they've been doing quite a lot in this regard, actually, sort of alerting people to this. And I was told that they're quite often being offered things, and they try and work out what to do with them. And so I think it's a question of sort of trying to, you know, it's all about education and empowering, actually, really. But it is, I mean, it is a really, really big problem, this.
Any other questions?
Hi. I was wondering, I find it quite interesting, the questions of ownership, provenance, and indeed looting within the sphere of digital and online art. Because there are many platforms that say that they claim to protect the ownership of digital art, but the looting, like, is it still looting?
Wow, that's an interesting question because I really don't know the answer.
Well, okay, I'll take a swing at it, to use an American metaphor. The law would say something rather different. It's a copyright infringement, right? If you're like pillaging somebody else's visual metaphor, even color palette that's just too striking and you haven't given due credit, and then you market it as your own. So I think that draws us into a broader philosophical question, right, about ownership and the kind of creation history of a piece of work, which is particularly interesting in the realm of contemporary art production, and that's something that I know a little less about, but I'm glad that you brought that in because it is something that's incredibly important to think about, and then joining up the dots from the realm of artifact looting, and then the kind of questionable provenance that flows from that, along with, as you quite rightly point to, the pilfering of creative content from digital art. And then really who owns it then when it's in a publicly accessible sphere?
I think that just to finish, I think that question, for example, it really puts together the degree to which looting, it's not only about artifacts and this idea of the longer view, like it's a whole set of practices that are everywhere in our cultural environment, and the reason why it was important that we have this conversation and that this conversation will continue, especially inside institutions. Thank you.
Thank you.